pretty cool to be this side of the podium again. I haven't been done a talk, I think, since the start of the year, actually, in person. So it's, yeah, pretty cool to be studying this side again. This is a version of a talk I did for Nomad PHP back in, goodness me, February, March, April time earlier this year. So I did a 5-10 minute lightning talk for them. And this is sort of that talk with some of the stuff put back in that I couldn't fit into 10 minutes before. And yeah, I'm giving this talk at PHP Northwest in October, but also in a couple of Drupal camps later on in the year as well. So any feedback would be appreciated for sure. So yeah, I've called this deploying PHP and anything else with Fabric. So I'm mostly using it with PHP, but it can be used for sort of anything, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This is me, as you can tell. So I'm a web developer primarily, but I also do some Linux system administration, hence Fabric. I work at a company called Microserve. We're a specialist Drupal agency based in Bristol. So a lot of my experience comes from doing Drupal. However, Drupal, and if you've seen, I've done talks before on Sculpin, which is a PHP-based, composer-based static site generator. But I guess sort of on my own experience, I also do some work with Symfony and Silex and Laravel, which I haven't put on the side, and I've typoed Silex. Awesome. So this is one of the cool things about Fabric, is you can really use it to work on multiple different things at the same time. Also, not a Python developer, which you'll sort of notice because Fabric is written with Python. So if anybody knows Python, my code probably isn't the best, but okay. So what is Fabric? As I said, it's a command line tool written in Python. So it's sort of similar to your sort of Symfony console-ish things. You run on in a terminal on the command line, rather than sort of like a GUI or 3 UI. It runs commands on local and on remote hosts. So initially I thought of it being more like sort of an SSH wrapper that went onto a server and runs tasks. It does do that, but it also runs commands locally, which is awesome. It's super flexible. So as I said, I'm using it for a variety of Drupal 7, Drupal 8 builds, which are completely different. Laravel, Sculpin, Symfony, like a whole list of different things. It can be used for things that are not PHP even, but in terms of what it runs can be different. It can be sort of super simple things that just do almost like a git pull and a composer install, or it can be like really more complicated things like Capistrano type things that clone stuff into different repositories and does symlink switching and all sort of more complicated things, which we'll get to. And yeah, for me, it's a good way of combining multiple scripts. So before this, I sort of had a Jenkins server. I'd push code up to GitHub or GitLab or whatever. That pinged Jenkins. Jenkins started doing a build, and I'd have like 4 or 5 different build steps. So I had my like pre-deploy stuff. So I'm doing database backups and file permission checking and things. Then the actual build, and then sort of post things in a different file, which gets just a little bit crazy. This is sort of one of the things I used to have. So common SH would have things like my path to my file project directory on the server. There's my pre-deploy, my post-deploy things, and then another strip that does nightly database backups or whatever. There's some of these with more of them as well, and these were probably set mostly per project, so different things depending on project A versus project B versus project C versus Drupal 8 versus Drupal 7 versus Laravel, etc. So a lot of duplication, a lot of copy and pasting, and a lot of just craziness, really. Installing Fabric is pretty simple. Pip is Python's package manager, so it's very similar to sort of Composer and NPM and those types of things. So if you've got pip, you can just run pip install Fabric. If you're running Mac OS, like me, then you can run brew. And if you're running it on a Debian or Ubuntu, the package name changes depending on which distribution you're running. So I think it's now just install Fabric, or it might be Python-Fabric, depending on when and or your distribution. So once we've got it installed, we need to start writing fab files. So we start, they're generally called fabfile.py, and this is what fab will look for by default when you run command. At the top of the file, we need to start calling importing things. So this is very similar to sort of PHP import and use statements. In fact, it's more similar probably to PHP 7 because you're sort of saying from this thing I want to import multiple things rather than having them all separate lines. So the main thing is to call from fabric.api, and you just include the things that you need to include. Alternatively, you can just do this and import everything, which I see quite frequently. This works. I'm in two minds about it. Sometimes I prefer to do this, seems better to me for performance maybe, but yeah, I'm lazy, so probably that was fine. Then we can start setting environment variables. So the first thing we're going to set is, first we're going to set are some hosts. So these are going to be your server names or your IP addresses for your sort of server or servers. Most of the time I'm going to include something called use SSH config. So that's if you've got an SSH config file locally, it's telling you to use certain keys and certain usernames. You can tap into that and use those. Or you could actually define SSH usernames and actually passwords and keys and various other things at the top of your file. I tend to then just sort of declare some variables right at the top. So things like my project directory, where the code is going to live, git repos, git branch to clone, that type of thing, maybe at the top of the file. Once we've got that, we can start doing stuff, and by stuff, I'm sort of adding tasks. So these are things you can actually call from the command line. So this is a pretty straightforward task. We start with def, which I assume is for define. We give it a name. In this case, we call it build. You can pass arguments, which we'll see in a minute. This one doesn't have any. And then start listing your tasks. So in this case, we start with. So essentially we're saying change into this directory, which is going to be var.html, where our project lives. And then once you're in that directory, start running tasks. So in this case, we can use the keyword for run, which essentially is saying SSH onto my server and run this thing, or run these two things. So run is referring to a remote server or remote system. So in this case, yep, it's going to run git pull and then run a composer install, which is fine. Super simple, works. It's brilliant. As I say, we can add parameters to tasks also. So in this case, we're going to add a parameter called run composer. We're going to set it to true by default. Python variables seem to use uppercase things for like uppercase T for true and uppercase N for none. Initially, I tried not doing that, but it seems better to sort of stick with the convention for Python. And then, yeah, we can just use if statements and conditionals within our code. So run composer is true, and then if run composer, then we can run the thing. So of course, then we can set that to be false if we didn't want to run it. So again, that gives us some of the flexibility there. We can add multiple parameters. So in this case, if we wanted to add an environment parameter, we can set it to be production by default. And then we can use the environment to say use composer install or composer install no dev, depending on the environment. The nice thing I found actually about running these is different to PHP. Is you don't have to include all the variables one after the other. So in this case, if we wanted to say build and wanted composer to be true, we could only set env equals something else. As long as you reference them by name, they don't have to be in the right order, which I found was quite cool. And tasks can call other tasks, which I quite like because it keeps things nice and clean. So maybe my build task does stuff, and then I have another task that says post install tasks, which is going to do things like run my database updates, run my entity definition updates, and rebuild my cache. You'll see at the top here, we've got one that says @task, and if you don't include that, everything essentially is public, and you can run them all by name, which we'll see in a minute. But if we define @task, that essentially is setting it to be public, and therefore everything else is private. So in this scenario, I could run fab build, and it would run the build task, But if I tried running fab Drupal post install, it wouldn't run because it's not been defined as a task. So it's some way of setting, just a nice way of breaking up, rather than having really, really long tasks, split them up into several things, smaller things even. So yes, running tasks, we can run fab -s list, will just show us a list of all the available commands within our file. We can then run by calling it by name. So in this case, yeah, we've got one called build. So we can run fab build, we'll run the build task within our file. As I said, by default, it will look for a file in your common directory, which is fabfile.py. You can call them different things, or you can have multiple of them. And you can either use -f and then a fab file name, or you can use -s fab file. This gives you, you can specify different ones. And the bottom example is where we're actually passing parameters, where we pass the parameters into the task. So in this case, this is one, maybe the Jenkins is running. We're going to run the task, and by doing that, we're going to pass through parameters called build number, and pass through a build ID, maybe from Jenkins, and specify build types. And these are the values that get passed into the task. So yeah, build composer could be false if you want to override it here. This is something I've been using quite a lot recently for building sort of front-end assets things. So I tend not to have like compiled CSS and things in my repository. I tend to use a preprocessor for that. So this is an example of a task for actually building the front-end assets. So in this example, we're going to be using gulp. So we define the task called build assets. We just change into the theme directory for where my theme is. I think this is probably a Drupal example, maybe, or Sculpin example. In this case, we can then run yarn, if yarn is still a thing, I guess, to install our npm dependencies. And again, if gulp is true, then we're going to run the gulp things. Error reporting. So this is great. We can sort of assume everything's going to work. That obviously is not always the case. So we can start doing things like this, and we can run commands, and then get the response, and the response is returned back by running the command. So we can actually run checks against it, and we can say something like, in this case, we can run drush status, which is going to, so drush is the Drupal shell. Running status is going to just show you a status page of your application, and things like if the database is connected and if the connection to the database is successful. Two things, very similar. This is just a nice way of just saying, after you've done a deployment, is Drupal speaking to the database, and is it actually running or not? So we can run this, and then in this case pass it through egrep, looking for those two strings being connected or successful. And if it failed, we know we couldn't connect to the database. So we can add that in there. We'll probably exit out at that point. Alternatively, we could also check on the return code. So it's going to return back 0 for no errors or 1 for errors. So this is just an example of running sculp and generate, and if it returned back 0, it built the site. Otherwise, it didn't. This is great, but we can start to make fab files a little bit smarter. And by smarter, I'm sort of referring to adding conditional tasks. So rather than assuming that having one fabric file for everything, we can start making things a bit more flexible. So we can extend the build assets job by initially checking if the package.json file exists. If that exists and maybe node modules doesn't exist, then we need to run yarn, we need to run npm. So we can do that. And then if you've got a gulp file, let's assume we need to run gulp. And then alternatively, if you've got a grunt file, you want to run grunt. So this means we can have one gulp file working across multiple projects depending on what files are present in that repository. This is pretty cool. There's something, I think the gulp examples are fine. If you've got a gulp file, you can sort of assume that you want to run it. We maybe have some instances with composer files where sometimes we want to run composer install and some we don't. Sometimes we have vendor directories committed to our repository because hosting. So this sort of situation isn't going to work for that. So what I did start doing is working with something like this and having sort of a settings file per project. In this case, I've gone with just a YAML file called app.yaml, something that's going to live in the repository of our project. And this is where I can actually define stuff like what we want the project to do. So in this case, we can say composer install true because we want it to run. If for this particular project, maybe we didn't want it to run because we already have dependencies there, we could obviously set it to false. And we can tell Fabric a little bit here about this Drupal site. This is from Drupal 8, so you can import configuration for files. Particular projects that we've got depending on the hosting provider, the subdirectory where the project files are can change. Some tend to use docroot, some will use web, some will use public, all depending on the host. So in this case, I can specify that in root. I can give it some metadata about my theme in terms of what am I actually running. Am I using gulp or grunt, and do I want to run npm or yarn, and just define the path to my file, to the theme, and also tell it which Drupal version we're running. So rather than letting Fabric sort of try and figure out these things for ourselves or for itself, I quite like being able to sort of set these things in this type of file and specify exactly what I want it to do, rather than it try and figure it out and maybe not always get it right depending on the situation. Yeah, so this file is sort of in the repository. Within the Fabric side of things then, obviously we're still importing the stuff from Fabric, but then we can import YAML from Python, open our app YAML file as a read-only thing, load it, read the file, and set that to a config variable. So that makes those settings available to Fabric, and then we can start using it. So maybe within that build assets job again, we can get the config from the theme and pass those details in and say that given this is the path, and then if build equals build npm is true, run it, or vice versa. So this is again making it even a little bit more flexible, I think, because we can reuse the same Fabric file across multiple projects and multiple scenarios, and we can define sort of explicitly what we want it to run and when, depending on the project. So this was fine. I quite like this approach. I then started playing with something else, actually defining, rather than setting sort of true or false values for things, actually trying to find a way that I could do something like this. So within that file, specify some commands and have build commands and deploy commands. And rather than sort of saying gulp equals true, actually specifically say, go into this directory, run this command, that command on build, and then likewise for deploy. That sort of works. I got to this point. So you can still get the commands from the config variable, split them based on the new line, and sort of just run them. This seems to work fine, except for if you want to run certain things locally, which we'll get to, just having to do string replacements based on the commands. This is all great. Yeah, basically using the run command for everything right now, which means it's going to run everything remotely rather than actually on our server. So building on prod is not good, it makes people sad. So how can we not do things directly on production? So we can either build things locally, maybe on a local laptop or through Jenkins or some sort of CI tool, which we'll talk about, or we can actually do something like building in a separate directory, running through all the tests, importing the database, then running health checks, and then sort of switching that version to be the active one after it's built. Let's start by doing the first. This is pretty straightforward, actually. Rather than using run, we can import a different command called local, and that just runs things locally rather than running it remotely. So we can run things like git pull and get things like compose install locally, rather than on the server. Then it's a case of just deploying everything. Just in some sort of simple examples, so I've used RSYNC for this. This is a good point to sort of note that Fabric, as well as Fabric API, has a Fabric contrib sort of repository, I guess. One of the things I've been using here is RSYNC, so it's just a nice wrapper around the actual RSYNC command and trying to remember which things go in which order. So it's got a nice sort of DSL for that. You can pass things through. So in this sort of scenario, we've taken away the issue of having to run things like compose install on a server, and we're running those things locally instead. and then pushing the resulting file up. The other thing we could do is build it in a separate directory and run it after doing the build. So this is what I've been doing, importing time rather than, importing time from Python and starting to set variables like next release. So in this case, we're actually getting the timestamp of the job. And if there is no project directory, we're going to start making other directories, things like called shared. So maybe shared is where you have persistent storage, like Drupal file directory where users are uploading files and that type of thing. Those things might go into shared, and then we're going to make a separate directory called releases. Once we've done that, we can then start running commands like git clone, and rather than a clone, we're going to into the main directory, we're going to run it into a subdirectory of releases based on the current timestamp. So this sort of $S syntax is very similar to PHP's sprintf or vsprintf function. It does, I always do it the wrong way. I always do it the PHP way initially, and then have to remember it's Python, and I have to separate it with a percentage in the middle. So in this case, we're just telling it to take the two strings separated by a slash, which is our release directory. And once we've done that, we can then run our different other tasks. Assuming that all goes well, we can then run something that points at symlink, called something like current is what we tend to use, which signifies this is the current release that we're currently working on, which is just a link to that release. So we end up with something like var WHTML current, and that's where we point our symlink to. So all of our composer install and all of our dependency management and our asset generation is done separate to live, and only at the point if we know that it's actually worked and it's successful, we'll be able to sort it out. Other things we can do, or things we might want to do, database backups pre-build. So this is something I was previously doing in one of my bash scripts. So just if something does go wrong, we've got a backup, which is obviously a good thing to do. Rollback on failure. So if one of the error reporting things comes back with a failure, we might want to stop the build and maybe revert back to the previous build. We want to, if we're running Drush for Drupal or Symfony console, or maybe Laravel Artisan commands like migrations or things, we can run those. Verifying file permissions, restarting services. So maybe if you're running Apache or Nginx, you want to restart those after deployment. We can do that. And essentially anything that we can do on a command line, we can do through a Python, through Fabric. And these are some resources that I've been doing. So the top is the link to this talk. Secondly is the FabFile website for Fabric. A couple of example repos that I'm currently working on, and a deploy series from Chris Fidao, who does servers for hackers. That's a really good talk that covers a lot of this something in depth. This is the join link. Gone through this a bit faster than expected, to be honest. Yeah, and these are my sort of contact details for things. So yeah, so have you got any questions? No.
So it seemed a lot of the stuff you're doing, things like, you know, taking database dumps or composer installs and stuff like that, and it looked like it was just wrapping bash scripts.
Yep.
It does Fab have, because presumably like composer install is a pretty common thing, does it have like libraries that do all these common tasks? Or
there are a lot of them for things like running maybe around like the Linux Unix commands, so things like running sed and that type of thing. Also there's things for that, or you could just run them sort of manually. I don't think there's ones for like composer exactly, but yeah, you could just use those like RUD or local would run those for you. Yeah.
Because you can actually write Python without the Fabric, how often do you find that you program yourself into a code versus something that's more declarative, which is config driven?
I don't think I've had that. I think most of my stuff has been fairly maybe sort of straightforward in terms of what it's doing. I haven't maybe gotten to that point yet. I think if we were to do some of the more complicated stuff, I probably would end up doing that, but so far I haven't. I have experimented by doing Python within Fabric, so all the getting the app configuration things isn't Fabric. That's done with Python particularly. That's been quite an interesting experience. Not coding in Python, really, being more PHP. So it's been a bit of a learning curve on that regard. But that was quite interesting to sort of think, how could I do this particular problem, and then maybe I could take that, which has a YAML thing, and Fabric, and put the two together. That's how I sort of got into that scenario. Yeah, I haven't really come into sort of programming corners yet. Touch wood. But maybe. Yeah.
Quite a lot of the heavy lifting is done with the run command. Does that have like on error? Does it? Is there a way of like aborting the process if something goes wrong?
So yeah, if there is an error, it'll just stop running through the commands at that point. So if run 1 failed, it wouldn't sort of get to the second one. But as I say, there are ways of doing, let me find it, like this type of thing. So you can actually check like the error code of something. So this could be if a file exists or if an actual process failed to complete or did complete. You can either check .failed and maybe run something like, I think system exit is the Python thing. That would just abort at that point. There is an option to pass, I think it's one only equals true or something as a parameter in there, so it'll sort of display the error but not actually exit out. So you get some flexibility around that. But yeah, I use these quite a lot for, does this particular file exist or not, or did this process complete successfully, particularly in the first example. The other way I've sort of found is to do this one that's like this as well, is to use like the exists keyword. So this comes from the file, I think, repository that Fabric offers. So this could also be, you could be running some like stat to say, does this file exist also, and then checking the error code from that. But yeah, this gives it a bit more, this is a bit more readable, I think, if something exists or doesn't. Yeah.
So is there any way to do like transactions or rollbacks if I have an issue in the middle of my deployment process and I have an error? Am I just stuck at that point and I have to manually intervene, or is there any way to go back on what I've done and just go back to the last working state?
Mm-hmm. So this is something I'm trying to do with, let's see, where are we? Yeah, so this type of approach is quite good for this, so maybe I could go into this a bit more detail. So yeah, we've got one version, which is maybe our current live version. We know that's obviously working. If we were to push a new release, rather than like overriding our existing application or running our database updates against the live database, what we could actually do is create them in a separate directory, maybe done by timestamp, and run all of our updates there. And then if something fails, then it's a case of we haven't touched live then at all in that case. So we could safely just abort that job there without affecting live. The other thing I've sort of been doing a little bit is maybe within this sort of update symlinks job, is we could store the timestamp of the previous release, maybe as a text within a text file, and then use that to sort of roll back. And the nice thing about having this sort of symlink sort of approach is the only way, if you want to roll back to a previous version, we're just updating the symlink, the current symlink, back to a different timestamp. With Drupal things, it's going to be more difficult because there's a lot of things in your database with older versions probably. I think Laravel supports sort of migration rollbacks between versions, so that might be a bit easier. Although in this case, I'd probably have, take like a backup post-deploy, pre-deploy, just in case, and then if that fails, you could re-import it if that was the case. Or you could say just have multiple databases, and if that fails, you swap them over and do it that way. So there's some redundancy in taking that type of approach if that's what you need.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I've got an answer for that as well.
Okay.
The with command you see in that is called context manager in Python. So it enters a block. And if you exit the block for any reason, either by ending a statement or with an error, that with has an inverse function. So CD will change into that directory, and when it exits the block, automatically change back to the previous one. And it's very easy to write custom context managers. So if you have a command that starts and stops and you know how to reverse it, you can write a context manager that will either complete successfully or roll back on error, whatever the error is.
Okay, that sounds quite good.
does the RSYNC handle the keep sensitivity of different file systems, like your local and the remote have different key sensitivity?
I think that maybe depends on what you're deploying to. I think Linux does care and Mac doesn't. I think this is just more of a wrapper around. Yeah, so I think it's going to use RSYNC on the directory. But yeah, this is quite a nice way of declaring RSYNC, because I'm always going, what do these, like, which order do I define the things, which are the letters I need to pass as options, and what do I want to exclude? I end up with, so dash exclude this and dash exclude that, and end up with a really long sort of command, whereas being able to do them in this way is a lot more readable, I think, as well. Yeah, I use this for more sort of simpler things, like static site generator or something that just needs to just deploy the changes up there. That's fine. Yeah, that works. Thank you again.
Do you need Python on the remote server?
I don't think so. There's always going over. Oh, actually, I think it's running. If it's running SSH commands, I guess it wouldn't. I'm not sure, but I think most distro would have Python. I think mine will do anyway, right? But maybe not.
Your minimal doesn't. You don't need it. You don't. Okay. We should. Got another question. Does it use SSH pipeline? Or does it open a SSH connection for every request?
I haven't. I'd assume not, but I'm not entirely sure. I'd hope not, because if I was running a really long task, you'd have to sort of close and reopen the connection every time. So I'd hope it would just keep one connection, maybe within each sort of width block or something. It would just keep the connection open for that. Maybe. Good question. I'll find out. Yeah.
Have you tried Robo? It's a PHP task runner. So it does pretty much all the same stuff that you can write in PHP.
Yeah, I have seen it mentioned, but yeah, I did look at it briefly for a while. But I think all these people started looking at this. But yeah, I thought that was quite interesting with it being PHP. Would be quite interesting.
In stuff like Composer and that kind of thing, because it's in PHP.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Maybe it's something I'll take a look at again. But yeah, it's something I'm familiar with. Yeah.
When you update the symlinks to upgrade the version, how do you clear bulk caches absolute path cache from the CLI?
Well, the path, I assume, it's always going to be pointing at least from a Docker root perspective, it's always going to be pointing at the same path. It was /current. Sorry. This is running. No, not running Docker.
Okay. Because Opcache has different cache for CLI and FPM. So the symlinks might still point to the old one, even though the symlink points to somewhere different, so the cache hasn't been cleared.
Okay, it's something that I do normally, like, I have a job that, assuming that everything passes, will restart services like Nginx and PHP FPM, probably for that reason. There's probably a more elegant way of doing that, but yeah, I'm assuming it all passes.
You have to restart FPM because it's not showing cache.
Okay.
So actually on that point, does that mean you have you can log in as different people, doing different things? Like if you're going to restart, I don't know if you maybe as it's used for deployment, maybe they can do everything. But if you want to log in as different or SSH as different users, is that possible, or does it always use the same?
I think it always uses the same one based on the thing. Normally I have like a user on that server who can just run maybe sudo commands for that one service. So it can't run sudo for everything, but if it's running sort of Nginx reload or something, it can run that, but not everything. So I tend to have like a user for that specifically. Any more? Cool. Thank you.